Welcome to Build an E-commerce Store with React, a premium course that shows you step by step how to build your own full stack e-commerce app where you can start selling your own digital or physical products. We'll learn the ins and outs of building dynamic web pages with Next.js, designing impressive user interfaces with TailwindCSS, accepting checkout payments with Stripe, creating a fully featured shopping cart to check out multiple items, and tons more. By the end, you'll have a production-ready e-commerce store that can start accepting customer payments and orders and is entirely free to run. This course is for anyone who wants to learn how to build truly epic full-stack apps with React, and you can start making them right now. Just click the link below and let's dive in. So what tools are we going to need to build this e-commerce app? Well, we're first going to need Node.js. If you don't have Node already installed, you can go to nodejs.org and grab the long-term support version of Node. When you install Node, you're going to get npm, which is what we're going to use to install all of our packages and run our scripts. I'd recommend a good code editor like Visual Studio Code. You can grab it at code.visualstudio.com. It's what I'll be using throughout the course. And finally, make sure that you have Git installed on your machine. We're going to be using Git along with GitHub to make changes to our code. And most importantly, when we deploy our app to the web, we're going to use Git and GitHub to take any commits that we've made and then push them to Vercel, which is our deployment service, to apply those changes in our production website. So if you've got all of those things installed, let's now move on to the next step of creating our Next.js project. In this course, we're going to be using Next.js to build our e-commerce store. Next.js is the go-to React framework for building web applications, and it's really easy to get started. You can find the documentation for Next.js at nextjs.org/docs. I'm going to be referring to it quite a bit as we build our app. And you can certainly set up Next.js manually. However, there's a more convenient tool to use, which is Create Next App. We're going to be creating our project from scratch, with the exception of some assets that I'll give you to speed up development a little bit. So provided that you have Node.js and therefore npm installed, we can run this command in our code editor, npx create next app at latest. So we can copy this and go to VS Code, open up our terminal, which you can access by going to View, Terminal, or hitting the shortcut Control and then the tilde key, which is right underneath the escape key. And you want to run this wherever you'd like to create your Next.js project. I'm going to create mine on my desktop, so I'll run this. It's going to ask you if you want to install the following packages. We're going to hit yes, or just hit enter. We're going to name our project Epic Store, or whatever you'd like to name your app. We're not going to use TypeScript, so you'll use the arrow keys to select no. We do want to use ESLint. We want our project to be linted. We are going to be using TailwindCSS with this project, so we'll select yes. And we want to use the source directory with this project, so we'll select yes as well. We do not want to use the experimental app directory, and we want the import alias source / and then use the star or asterisk symbol. This means that we're just going to be able to import any file in our source directory starting with the absolute path source / whatever the rest of the file path is. So now we can hit enter, and we're going to see that it's going to install our dependencies, and it's going to set up Tailwind and ESLint for us automatically. And once that's done, we can cd into Epic Store, or we can just drag that folder into VS Code. And once you do so, you should see all of the files here that were created in our project. You should have a Node modules folder indicating that all of our dependencies have been installed. And we can now run our project if we open up our terminal once again by running npm run dev. And then we can head over to localhost 3000. We can hit command or control click. And now we can see we have a working Next.js app. And with all that done, we can move on to the next step, which is bringing in our site assets. And this will be useful for adding a unique style to our store, as well as adding images and data to all of the products that we're going to be adding to our store and enabling our users to purchase in the future. Now we want to grab all of the site assets that we're going to be using. This includes information about our products, as well as images that I've included to help you out in adding these dummy products to Stripe. Make sure to use whatever real products that you like in the future. Feel free to customize it, as well as a custom logo that I've created to help improve the style of our app a little bit. So make sure that you click the link below this video, and when you do, you'll be given this assets zip file. Make sure to unzip it, and if you go into this assets folder, you'll have a public folder and this products.js file. Grab both of those, and let's go into our project folder and drop both of those files in. We want to replace the public folder with the one that already exists. So now if we go back to our project, if we go back to Visual Studio Code, we should see a products.js file in the root folder, and the public folder should have a favicon, a couple of logos, and a bunch of products here, a bunch of product images. And a good idea for any project that you're building is that you want to keep track of your files with the help of Git. So because you have Git installed, you can open a separate terminal, and since Next.js has already initialize Git for us automatically when we run that create next app command, we can commit all these files by saying git add and use a period to select all, git commit, adds, products. So now we're keeping track of changes that we make to our code, and feel free to use Git whenever we make changes for each video in this course. Be aware that it's not required, but it's just a good practice to develop as you're making your projects to keep track of changes over time. It's not only going to help you, but it's going to help any developers that are working on this project with you. Before we can start building our own user interface, we need to gut the template, all of the default code that the default Next template comes with. So we want to remove everything on the home page as well as the custom CSS, etc. We're going to begin by going into source. So all of our source code once again is going to be in the source folder, and by going to styles. You can see here that Tailwind set up, and if we go to the package.json file, Tailwind not only consists of this TailwindCSS dependency, but also a dependency called auto-prefixer and post-CSS. And you'll see that there's a post-CSS file here as well. So this is automatically included whenever we set up Tailwind, and we know that Create Next App did that for us automatically. But to get Tailwind working, we need to have a CSS file with these @Tailwind utilities. Everything after this can be removed. We can remove all of that because those are custom styles that are added, but all of this above is necessary for Tailwind to work properly. So we can make the changes to our globals.css file, save that, and if we were to go to our in the pages folder _app.js, this is where it's being imported and used. So now we don't have any custom styles being applied, just the styles that are written on the home page here. And we can also get rid of all of this and just replace it with a div with the text home. We can also remove the imports for next image and next font /Google. So now we just have a totally empty home page. Additionally, we can get rid of the hello.js file within the API folder. We can keep the API folder. We're going to be using that. This is where our API routes are going to go. But this is where we want to start. And additionally, if we go to tailwind.config.js, you'll see the default Tailwind theme has been changed. You can learn more about this by going to TailwindCSS.com and look up theme configuration. So you can see that there's a bunch of additional settings that can be applied in this tailwind.config.js file. You can set up screens to configure custom media queries for different screen sizes. You can add your own custom colors, change the font family, and apply a certain font for example, using the font sans class or the font serif class. But we can also extend themes and add additional properties, and that's what by default the next configuration is doing. So we can remove all of this. This is not required. So let's remove this extend object and just leave it like this. So with that, we should have a totally unstyled application. And the first thing that we're going to do is we want to add a common layout. And we saw this when we visited our deployed app. We saw that on every page we had a header and a footer and this main content here. So a layout's going to make it possible to show the same components across all pages. And therefore it's going to wrap the app itself. So if you want to provide a common layout across all of your pages, or want to add something like a provider using React Context, and many third-party libraries use these provider components. We're going to be setting one up for a library that we'll install later in the course. In short, if you want to apply things globally in your app, you want to do it on the _app.js page, and we're going to set up our layout around the component that's being output on every page. So to do this, we're going to create a new folder in source called components, and within it we'll make a layout.js file. We want to export default a component called app layout, and it should return a div, and this div will have the following classes. Now again, we're going to be using TailwindCSS, and the way that Tailwind works is by chaining together utility classes to apply different styles. So we're going to be covering what each of these styles do as we build the app. So don't be confused if you see a class that you're not familiar with. You'll probably see what it does just by writing it and hitting save. But if you're confused further, if you still don't fully understand, you can always do a quick search here at tailwindcss.com, look through the documentation. It's really very detailed, and it's going to give you information about all of the utility classes that Tailwind includes. But I'll do my best to explain what each of them do as we write them, because there's going to be a lot of classes that we write. So for our app, we want to have a minimum height of the screen. We want to cover the full height of the screen. We will use the flex class to use flexbox, and we're going to have several components in this. And we want to set the flex direction to flex column with this flex call property. So it's going to align everything vertically. Right now we're just going to have one element here. It's going to be a main element, and it's going to have the classes flex grow. We want it to take up the majority of the screen here, and we want it to have a background with bg dash, and there are a number of built-in colors to Tailwind CSS. If we go to background color, for example, you can see all of the different classes here and a preview of what those colors look like. And what's really neat about Tailwind is that if one of the colors isn't featured here, because of course there is seemingly an infinite amount of colors, well, there's technically not, but there's thousands and thousands of colors that you can potentially use, if not millions. If it's not included in this default list of colors, you can use what's called an arbitrary value by adding a set of brackets. So we can add our own value here and just write plain CSS by saying bg dash, and then within brackets set the color to a hex code that we want. And in this case, the background of our main area, of our main element, is going to be the hex code F7, F7, F7. And within this main element is what we're going to display the content of each page. So we want to accept this component and display it using a special prop called the children prop. So from the props object, and we can always destructure this object using just plain JavaScript, we can add a set of curly braces and grab the custom children prop and insert it here. And the way that it works is if we go into app and now import and use app layout, so just type the name of it, and you'll probably get an autocomplete that will then give you a suggestion to auto import this component. So you always want to type the name, and it should match what we wrote here. So if it was just layout, you would type layout, and it would be suggested to you. You can hit tab or click on that suggestion to have it auto imported. So this is a really convenient feature. And between the opening and closing tags of app layout, we want to include our component again. So now if we save layout and app.js, go back to our app, we don't see anything currently. That's because we haven't really included anything in our app layout. But if we were to add something, for example, a header, the text header, we would see it above right here. And if we had a footer, the text footer, we would see it at the bottom. So now we've seen how to add a common app layout. We've added some basic structure to our unstyled Next.js app. And in the next step, we'll see how to improve the font by using a custom font with the help of the built-in Next package. Using custom fonts can be quite difficult. The setup of font faces, the figuring out how to optimize them and make sure that there's no shifting, there's no flash of unstyled content. In the past, it was pretty difficult to set up custom fonts so that they would load performantly. But fortunately, since we're using Next, Next comes with a special dependency built into the core Next package that gives us built-in automatic self-hosting for any font file. And this allows us to load our custom fonts with zero layout shift. Next font gives us the choice to use Google fonts, such as the Inter font, or any fonts that are listed at fonts.google.com. These are all free to use, as well as any local fonts. If we scroll down, you can see it has support for local fonts as well. We're going to be using the Google font called Inter, and we're going to set this up within our layout component. So let's head back to layout, and up at the very top, we can import Inter from Next font / Google. And the reason that we're doing it here is because app layout, once again, wraps all of our components. And the way Next font works is essentially inserting it into an element, usually the top level element in our application. So Inter needs to be called like a function, and it accepts an options object. We can specify what font weights that we want, but leaving it empty just allows us to load any font weight that we like. We want to use the subsets array, the subsets property, which takes an array and allows us to determine what alphabet we would like, whether it's Cyrillic, Greek, Latin, or Latin extended. If you're writing in English, it's always going to be in Latin. And additionally, we need to, because we're using TailwindCSS, we need to use the variable property. Now, this allows us to set a custom CSS variable, and the reason for this is going to be apparent in a second. All CSS variables are prefixed with 2 hyphens, and then we give it a name, font inter, or whatever the name of the font that you're using is. And then finally, we want to set this equal to a lowercase inter variable, so that now we can insert our custom font into our application by changing the class name of this outermost div to accept a set of curly braces, and then use a template string where we can still include all the same classes that we had before, but we need to include a couple of things. The first thing is to insert inter.variable, and if we go to the TailwindCSS section, you'll see that we insert inter.variable as compared to inter.className. And we also want to set the class, use the Tailwind class of the font family that we're extending. And the font family that inter is going to be used for is the sans font family, or the sans class. So we want to add also font sans. So with that, we're not going to have a custom font loaded just yet. We need to change the tailwind.config.js file. And again, looking at the documentation, we need to extend the theme. So we want to, within the theme object, add the extend property, then add the font family property, and from there set sans, the class that we're using, to an array where its first value is equal to the CSS variable. So To use a CSS variable, we use the var syntax and then pass the variable name in between the parentheses here. So if we paste that in, we can then add a fallback value such as a sans serif. That's what every additional value will be. It'll be a fallback value to this custom font that we set here. So now we can save tailwind.config.js, and if we take a look, we can go to the Elements tab. If we right click, hit Inspect, and go to Elements, and go to our top level div here. We can see that we have this font sans class that's using font family value of the font inter CSS variable. And we can see that this custom font is being applied. If we just zoom in a little bit, if we just toggle this font family, you can see that we are in fact getting our custom loaded inter font. So now we have a custom font that we're using across our application. Again, feel free to check out fonts.google.com to provide your own if you would like something different than this one. And with that, we can move on to building out our header and footer to add some additional structure to our app layout. Now let's improve the appearance of our header and footer to what we have in the final version. So in the header, we're going to have our logo, we're going to have some text on the right hand side, and we're also going to have a link to our cart page, and it's going to include a preview of what's in our cart. So we'll have an icon, price, and the number of items in our cart, and then at the bottom we'll just have a simple footer with the name of our app. So that's going to be on either side or on the top and bottom of our layout component. So let's head to our layout component and let's head into app layout. We can jump to that by hitting Control or Command and then clicking on that component. We'll begin in the components folder. We'll create a header.js file, header.js, and we'll make a footer.js file too. Within header, we'll export default a new component with the name header, and we want to return a header element, and we'll have the classes sticky, so it'll stick to the top of the page as we scroll, with top 0 bg white, z10, which will set the z index to 10 to put it above all other elements. And then we'll add a shadow, a box shadow to it with the shadow class. Within our header, we'll have a div with the classes container, mx auto to center all of its content, p6 to give it some padding, and we can see exactly how much padding if we hover over it. We'll set display to flex, and we'll set justify between to separate the logo and the cart information on either side of the nav bar. So right now, if we save, we don't have anything. We just need to import it, import the header into our layout. So we want to replace the header element that we have there if you added a dummy header element. We'll import header, and so we have a basic structure, but we want to add the logo on the left and the cart information on the right. So let's create another component called logo. Once again, we'll create a new component that we'll export from this file, and we want to return a link component from next/link. This is as compared to using a plain set of anchor tags. It's going to allow us to navigate from one page to another without having the page do a full reload. We want to set the href to just /. This will take users to our home page. And we want to set the classes flex, items center, so we want to align them horizontally. And we also want to give them a bit of spacing in between by setting space x on the x-axis 2. And we'll begin within the link by adding an image, and this is going to come from next image. Again, this is going to replace just a plain image element. It'll be called image, and we'll set the source to /logo.svg. Make sure that you've brought in that logo.svg file from the assets folder into public. So this is reading from our public folder. When we just say /, we don't need to specify that it's public. We just say / and then the file name. Unless it's within a subfolder such as products, in that case we would add products slash whatever the file name was. We'll set in some alt text just like we would a normal image. We'll set that to logo. And we also want to specify, since we're using next image, we need to specify a concrete width and height in pixels. So we'll set width. This is a special prop. Width to 42 and height to 42. And then after the image, we'll have a span element with the classes font extra bold. So this is for our logo text. Text 3x. So we want very large text. We want to set its color by saying text gray 700. And we additionally want to hide it on small breakpoints. So when we have a mobile screen, for example, we want to hide it. We can do that by setting hidden, setting the hidden class. But when we're on small breakpoints and above, we can say SM colon, and we want to set it to inline block. And finally, make sure that we have the text, and that's going to be Epic Store. So let's bring in the logo. We'll provide it within our header. We'll import logo, and when we save, we have our icon text, and that text disappears when we're on a small screen. Next, we want to add our cart icon and information over here on the right-hand side. So that will all be within another next link, and this is going to have an href set to /cart. This is a page that we haven't created yet, but will towards the end of the project. And we'll set the classes flex, items center, space x1 to space out all these individual elements, the icon, the text, and the two text elements that we have. Again, text gray 700, and when we hover it, we can use a hover pseudo class by saying hover colon. We can make it a little bit darker by saying text gray 900. Now within this link, we'll include a div with the class name relative to set position to relative. We'll include a shopping cart icon, and this is going to be a custom component from a library that we haven't installed yet. So let's open up another terminal if you don't already have one open, and we want to say npm install @heroicons/react, and then we want to include an at the end to specify a specific version. So whenever we install a package, we want to fix it to we want to pin it to a certain version. So this is going to be to version 2.0.17. And when that's done, if we go to our package.json file, we'll see that that's been added. And now we can import shopping cart icon from, if we import it like this, from heroicons/react/24, which specifies the size of the icon. And then we have the option to choose an outline icon or a solid icon. And be aware that all of these icons are visible and searchable at heroicons.com. If we were to search for the shopping cart icon here, you'll see it corresponds with the name. We could just as well choose shopping bag. But just be aware that there are two sets of them, either solid or outline. So this icon is going to be a solid icon, and we'll add some classes to it. We can add classes directly on this, and this is a React component. If we hover over it, we can see that's being imported correctly. We'll set the classes to width 7, height 7, and flex shrink 0 to make sure it doesn't get any smaller than that. It doesn't change in size. And then after this div, we're going to have a paragraph element with the text size text large, where we want to include the price. We don't have it currently, so I'm just going to include some dummy text of $0.00. And then after that, I'll include a span, or rather it's still within the paragraph element, but after the text, I'll include a span with the classes text small, text gray 500, and this is where in parentheses we want to include how many items are in our cart, which is 0 currently. So if we save this, let's take a look at its appearance. Looks pretty good. We can improve this by adding a little space here between the text and the span by just adding within a set of curly braces some quotes and then a space in it. That'll add some additional space between these two numbers. And now the next step is to complete our footer component. So let's go to footer.js and complete a basic component of the same name, where we want to return some JSX. And remember that this is just some basic text to say copyright, current year, the name of our store, all rights reserved. So we will use a footer element, and the class is border top. So we're going to have a light border that will be set to border gray 100, so a very light gray. We'll add padding on the y-axis, so doing so sets it on the top and bottom. So padding y10, if we wanted to set it on the sides, we would say px10, or if we wanted to have it be all around, it would just be p10. But py10, and we want to center the text by setting text center, which is equivalent to text align center. And within this footer, we'll add a paragraph, which will include our text with the classes text small and text gray 500. So now we just need to import our footer in app layout. If we save that, we can see it at the very bottom. And now we have a pretty nice shared layout across all of our app's pages. The last step before we start working with products, adding them to Stripe, and figuring out how to create our store content, we see that if we take a look at the tab that our app is running on, it just says localhost 3000. If we head back to our deployed application, we can see that it has some metadata, specifically within the head element of each page. And that includes information such as the title and a favicon. So let's do the basics of adding metadata to our website. And we can do so with a custom element called Next Head. Again, this is from the core Next package. And we can just use a custom head component. And then between its tags as children, we can add whatever metadata that we like. It makes sense to add this to a component that's going to be on every page. And since we know that's our app layout component, we can go ahead and in the components folder create a file called meta.js. We'll export default a component meta, and we will return a head component. So we want to make sure to bring in head from next/head, and we want to add some basic metadata here. We'll add a title, which will set to the name of our app. We'll call it Epic Store. And to add a favicon, you can see that there's a favicon listed in the public folder. To be able to display that, we can use a link meta tag where we'll set the rel property to icon. We'll set the type property to image/x-icon and set the href to favicon.ico. Now, you may not see anything immediately. Well, first let's go ahead and import meta into app layout. Once you've done so, you may not see your favicon, and this has to do with your browser's cache. To override the cache and make sure that you see the favicon, you can just add the query string with a question mark v equals 1, and that should allow you to confirm that you see a favicon as well as your updated title. Feel free to include whatever extra information that you like here, such as a description, any open graph tags that you like. You can include really any metadata that you want in your production e-commerce store. So with that done, we now have a complete app layout component, and we're ready to move on to adding products to our store and figuring out how to display them in our pages. Stripe is going to be an essential tool for our store, not only for checking out our customers, giving us a really convenient checkout page, really nice APIs to work with that make creating and listing our products and prices and all that good stuff very easy, but additionally, it's going to manage our inventory. So we'll see how to do that in just a bit, but first we need to create a free account at stripe.com. So go there. If you don't have an account with them, make sure to create one. And once you've done that, you'll be taken to your dashboard. Just give your store a name. You don't need to provide all of the information that Stripe is asking for. You can do that at a later step if you want to sell products using Stripe. in production. Right now, we're going to be working with developer keys. You can swap these out for production keys that you can actually use to accept payments. At the moment, all we need to do is just make sure that we're on our test dashboard. And here you should see some keys for us in test mode. You can also find this just by searching for developer API keys. You'll be taken to an individual page here. And right now, we just want to copy the publishable key and secret key to work with Stripe on the client and on the server. So let's head back to our application. And in the root of our project, in the root folder, we want to create a new file, .env.local. This is going to store all of our environment variables. And at the moment, we're just going to have two. We're going to have one called, in all caps, Next public Stripe publishable key, and another one called Stripe secret key. When using Next.js, any environment variable prefixed with next public should be used only on the client, and if it doesn't have that prefix, it should only be used on the server. So despite the fact that this is an environment variable, if it's public, it's viewable to everyone. That's okay. That's why it's called publishable, but the secret key needs to remain secret and should only be used on the server. In fact, that's why by default, it's impossible in Next.js to use something, an environment variable that's not prefixed with next public on the client. Right now, we just want to copy the publishable key that we're given and set it equal to the Stripe publishable key that we just created. And the secret key needs to be revealed, and then we can copy it and paste it in for the Stripe secret key. And all you need to do right now is just save this file. In the next step, we're going to see how to make use of these keys, specifically the secret key, to start working with the Stripe API to create some new products in our products page here. Now that we have Stripe set up, we're ready to add products. And of course, we can add products through the UI that they have here at stripe.com. But it's much easier to do so, especially if you want to create a bunch of products in bulk via their API. So right now I'm at stripe.com/docs/API, and I'm specifically looking at the products API here. Stripe has a really extensive API for working with really every part of payment processing that you could think of. And they have options for just about every server-side library out there. So make sure whenever you're looking at these code snippets, you select the Node.js library, since that's what we're going to be working with. It'll give you a code snippet. It'll give you an example bit of code that'll show you how to work with this API, in this case specifically for creating a product, and what you're going to get back, often with very realistic data. This is where all of the data that I've included in the products.js file comes into play. If you haven't looked at this file yet, you'll see that it's just an array with a bunch of objects that include, for example, a product name, price, expressed as a decimal, the currency, which I'm going to be using is US dollars. Feel free to use your currency of choice wherever you are, as well as an image. And this is a remote image. I have included for you all of these images within the products folder in public as well, if you want to save them elsewhere. But we're going to be using all this data to create a bunch of products in bulk, and you can see exactly how we need to do it. The only thing that's required in creating a product is the name, but we also want to include all these fields here. We want to include the price, currency, and image. So the name is going to come from each of our product's name property, but to provide the price data, we'll have to use this parameter default price data. And this is what's used to create a new price object. This is something that Stripe will do for us automatically. To provide the currency, we need to provide this on this object, default price data, the currency. And the price is really what they call unit amount decimal. There is another property called unit amount, but this is in cents. So it might be slightly different for the currency that you're using. It's very easy to create a product and then delete it, as we'll soon see, if you've created something that's not exactly right. So how are we going to add all these products? Well, we're going to create a special script, and we're going to do so within a simple JavaScript file, which we'll call seed.js. And this is where we will use Stripe. We're going to use it in a slightly different way than in the rest of our project. We're going to bring in Stripe and the products data using common JS syntax instead of ES modules. So what this means simply is just saying const Stripe equals require the server-side Stripe package, which is what we're going to be interacting with. Remember, we're using the node library here. We're going to use this library, and it should only be used on the server to create our products in this case. And it also requires the secret key. You can see that it's prefixed with sk, test, etc. This is actually the real developer key that we just grabbed from the API keys page. To work with Stripe, we need to provide that after requiring Stripe. Before we go any further, however, we haven't installed Stripe, the npm library, in our project. So in a separate terminal tab, just run npm I stripe at version 12.1.1. And after grabbing Stripe, and we can see that it was successfully installed, we can also bring in our products. We want to require from /products, so we can loop over this array individually. And to set up Stripe, we call it like a function, and we pass in our secret key here. We're not going to use this value. We're not going to insert this value using process.env. The environment variable name, since this is just a one-off operation. We'll just insert it like this, but just be aware that you should delete this afterwards, after we run this. And we're going to put the result, the return value, in a variable. And this is what we can use to interact with the Stripe API. So for our script, we're going to need to call an async function. So this is an async operation. So if we want to await something, it needs to be in a function prefixed with async. So we're going to use what's called an IFI, an automatically invoked function expression. So we're going to have a parentheses, set of parentheses, and we're going to say async and just write an arrow function, and then immediately call it afterwards. And here is where we want to, in this function body, is where we want to loop over each product in our array. So we can just use a for of loop. We can say for const product of products. And for each product, we want to await stripe.products.create, where we set the name to the product name, again, corresponding with each of these properties that we have on each of the objects. The name is going to be set to product.name. The default price data, written in underscores, is going to be an object where we set the currency to product.currency, and the unit amount decimal field is set to product.price. And then finally, there's a helpful optional field for images. So you can list up to 8 URLs of images for our product. So we're going to add an images array, and we're just going to include one element in that array set to product.image. So now we can save this. Make sure to, when you instantiate Stripe, to end it in a semicolon. And we can log what comes back. We can log each of the products that are created by putting them in a variable called Stripe product. And we can log, for example, the Stripe product name and the Stripe product ID. So we'll save seed.js, and in a separate terminal tab, we can add all of our products by running the command node seed.js. And we should see each of these products being added one by one with the unique ID that Stripe returns. And if we head to the products tab and we refresh the page, we should see all of those products, their name, their corresponding price, formatted correctly, as well as the corresponding image from each of those URLs. Right now we have 8 individual products that we've added to our database. So we have something to display on the home page. Remember that these are ultimately going to be individual product cards that we can add to the cart. But how do we get them on the page? Well, we're using Stripe as our inventory. And the benefit of doing that is that it functions identically to a database. So if we were to make any changes to these, and we can edit, by the way, all of the information that we have here, we want it to be changed and those changes reflected in our page. So this is the benefit of using Stripe as a kind of database versus just importing those products from a static file, such as our products.js file. We're going to use another feature of the products API from Stripe, the list method, to list all of our products. If we go there, if we go to products and then list all products, you can see once again a sample request and response. You can see it's actually populated with real data. So our data that we're looking for is going to come back on this data property, and it's going to include a bunch of information that we need. Unfortunately, with Next.js, it's very easy to fetch our data on the server. Remember that all of our products have to be fetched on the server using the Stripe server library. We can do it on the server using a function called getStaticProps. And right now we're specifically going to do it on only one page, which is the home page. So to begin, we'll kind of take a step back and make sure that we're not including in our seed.js file our secret key. So just replace that with process.env.stripe secret key, or you can delete the entire file if you like, if you no longer need to seed or don't have any intention to seed products in the future. And the next thing that we'll do is we want to create a folder called utils and make a file in it called stripe.js. And we're going to use this to share our Stripe integration across multiple pages and files, so we don't have to keep calling the Stripe function here. And to do that, we're going to import using ES modules, import capital S Stripe from Stripe, and we want to export const a lowercase s Stripe variable, and we can once again call the Stripe function and pass in process.env, which is again how we reference an environment variable listed within our .env file, process.env.stripe secret key. So now we have this Stripe variable that we can import wherever we like, and we're going to import it in the index page. We'll reference Stripe, and we want to import it from source utils Stripe. And we're going to use this once again within that special Next.js function called getStaticProps. Remember, when you take a look at the signature of this function, that we always export a function. So you need to use the export keyword. And in every case, because we're going to be performing some async operation, we want to prepend the function with the async keyword. And it must be named getStaticProps, like this. It's going to return any props data as its own object right here. And what we want to pass as props to home, and all of this is going to come down to the component that's within the same file. We want to provide on the props object all of our products. And this is where we're going to use stripe.products.list. So we can just copy this. Note that in the example, they are setting a limit to the amount of products that they're getting. We could, for example, set this to 8 since we seeded 8 products. And instead of calling this products, I'm going to call this inventory. Now, we need to modify this data a little bit, but before we do that, let's just see what we get when we pass down all of what's on the inventory variable down to the products prop. So because we're specifying on this props object the products property, we have a products prop that we can destructure in home. And for right now, we're just going to console log and take a look at what's on that. So let's add that console log, save, and refresh the page. And we want to right-click, hit inspect, and go to our console. We see an object where we have a data property with 8 products. But if we expand each of these, or one of them, we'll see that it includes a bunch of information that we don't really care about. Remember that in our final app, we want to include the name, the price, image, as well as currency and their ID. And this is specifically going to be useful for being able to add a link to each individual product page. So we want to now take this inventory data, and remember that all of the data is actually on the data property. So we can say inventory.data in getStaticProps.map, and for each product, we can return an object where we need to set the currency as well as the ID, name, price, and image. However, before we attempt to do that, if you look at all the data that's being returned from the list method, you'll see that some of the things that we need are missing. Yes, it includes an ID, an image, the name, but it doesn't include any information about the price. It just gives us the price ID. So what can we do to fix this? Well, we can use or pass within list another property called expand, and this is an array, and because this is an ID here on default price, we can expand that ID by just including a reference to the path that can be found on. So in this case, it's going to come from data.default_price. So let's comment this out briefly. I'm just going to do this briefly to show you that when we do so, when we add this expand, we expand our default price, and we refresh the page and go to any one of our products. Now we have an expanded default price with all of the data that we need. And specifically, we want the currency property as well as the unit amount or unit amount decimal. We see that those aren't formatted. We'll see how to fix that in just a bit. But for now, we can map over inventory.data, and we can return the price from product.default_price, which allows us to add a currency property set to price.currency, an ID set to product.id, a name set to product.name, price, a price property set to price.unitAmount, an image set to product.images, and remember this is an array and we just want to grab the first image, the first element in that images array. And once we've mapped over all that data, we can return a products, we can call this a products variable, and we can provide that as the value to this products prop. And using the object shorthand, we can remove the value since the value, the key and value are the same name. Then we can save, and if we head back and log it one more time, we now have just an array of 8 objects that includes exactly the properties that we need, the currency, ID, image, name, and price. And now we're in a position to be able to display all of that data within our user interface. Now that we have all of our necessary product data, we're fetching them on the server from Stripe. We want to display them as individual cards on our home page. For that, we're going to head back to our index page. We can remove the console log, and we're going to create a basic structure here to surround each of our product cards. We're going to have a div with the classes container, and then on an XL breakpoint, we want the max width of the screen to be XL. We want margin set to 0 auto to center everything. The padding on the y-axis to be 12 and on the x-axis to be 6. And within that we'll have a div which will use CSS grid. So we'll create a grid of elements where on the largest breakpoint we'll have 4 cards. When it gets smaller it'll be 3, 2, 1 on mobile. So we'll have in that div we'll set up grid, we'll set display to grid with the grid class, and we want the gap between each of them on the x and y axis in both directions to be 8. On a large and an extra large breakpoint, we want the grid columns to be 4. On a large breakpoint to be 3, and then small grid columns will be 2, and then finally on the smallest size screen grid columns will be 1. And within this div, we can map over our products. We can say products.map, and for each product, we want to return a product card, which we haven't created yet. So within components, we'll create a product card.js file. We'll make a component within it that has the same name, and we'll begin by passing down the product data on a prop of the same name called product. So within product card, we can destructure that product data so that we can start inserting data as we create the UI for it. This whole product card is going to be a clickable link. So we first want to return a link from next link, and this is going to have a dynamic href. So we'll add a set of curly braces and then a template string where it will link to /product/product.id, and we want to set the class name to border2. We'll set a somewhat thick border. We will add a border radius, a rounded border radius, by setting rounded MD. Add the group class and overflow hidden to make sure that border radius works around our image at the very top. Then we'll have in our link an image, but we'll start with a div element wrapping it. That'll be of class relative, of position relative. It'll be full width, and it'll have a height of 64. Now within this div, we're going to once again use a next image, so we'll make sure to import that from next image, next/image. And here we want to set the source to product.image. The alt text will be the name of the product from product.name. And if we go to the next documentation, we can learn a little bit more. If we type in next image, or we type in image to the search at nextjs.org/docs, you can see all of the props that it accepts. Of course, we're passing a source. We covered width and height. But what if we don't want to provide a static width and height? Well, there is a prop that we can use called fill. It's a Boolean that causes the image to fill the parent element instead of setting width and height. So we can do that. We can provide the fill prop here. And let's save. Let's make sure that we import product card and save just to see the result that we get. And we're getting an error telling us it's an invalid source prop. This image, which is coming from Stripe, remember that we just uploaded our product with a static URL. This isn't being hosted on Stripe servers. It's from that URL that we included. We need to tell Next.js that we're trying to get images from this specific domain. So it's telling us this host name, which we can copy, or your specific host name if you're hosting it elsewhere, is not configured under images in your next.config.js. You can follow that link to learn more about it, more about that error, but all we really need to do is go to next.config.js and just add the images property, which is an object, and there's this domains property, which is an array of strings, and we need to add this specific host name to domains to say, hey, we're going to be getting images specifically from this domain. We have to whitelist it. So once we save that and we refresh, our error goes away and we can see a bunch of images here. Now, we're getting some warnings, and the reason for this is next image has the fill prop but is missing the sizes prop, and we need to add it. And again, there's a link to learn more about it. To fix this, since we really want it to fill up 100% of the width, we can set sizes to 100%. And if we refresh that, we shouldn't get any errors except for the warning each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And this is because we're mapping over the product card component, but we haven't set the key. So we'll set the key prop to product.id. And if we refresh that again, it goes away. Now, one last thing that we can do, one last warning from next image, which can be very finicky, is it's telling us that this image with source, this first image, in other words, was detected as the largest contentful paint. It's saying essentially, this is being loaded immediately, and next image tries to load our images as performantly as possible. It uses lazy loading behind the scenes, under the hood. So we need to tell it, hey, this needs to be loaded immediately. And we can do that with the priority prop. One way to fix this, if we'd like, even though it's not necessarily required, is we can pass an index down to our product cards. So we can pass an index prop here, and we can destructure that from our props object within product card, and we can say, okay, for our image, we can have priority be true by writing a condition where if the index is equal to 0, meaning the first element in our array, in our first product card, I should say, if that's the case, then priority will be set to true, and you need to load this immediately. And now if we refresh, that error goes away. But for right now, let's finish with the rest of our basic UI. We'll make some improvements to this later and we'll make it functional, but we just want to get it looking somewhat like this. After our image, we're going to have a div which will contain the name of the product, a dummy rating, as well as the price and add to cart button. So let's add a div with the class P6 to add padding on all sides and BG white. Then we'll include the product name within a paragraph element where we'll set the font to semi-bold, text to large, display the product name by saying in curly braces product.name. After this paragraph element, we're going to include a rating component. I'm not going to create that just yet. For right now, we just want to display the price and the add to cart button. So underneath this paragraph, we're going to create a div with the classes MT4, margin top 4, flex, items center, justify between to space between the price and the button, and space x2. So first we're going to have the price displayed within a div, and in that div is going to be another paragraph element where the class name is set to text gray 500 to display the text price, and then a sibling div with the classes text large and font semi-bold to actually display the price itself from product.price. And then after this inner div, we'll include our button with the text add to cart. And for now, we'll just make it a lime green button by adding the class's border, rounded large, again to set a rounded border radius, padding y1, px4, and we actually need to bring in the button inside of the p6 div right here. And once we do that, once we bring our button up and hit save, we have all of our products nicely styled. And in the next section, we'll see how to make all of these product cards functional and cover things like how to format this price, as well as how to start adding our items to our cart. Before we continue, I wanted to share with you one really helpful VS Code extension. You can think of extensions as kind of add-ons to VS Code. If you're using VS Code as your editor and you're working with Tailwind, I'd highly recommend grabbing the IntelliSense extension. So you can go to View and then Extensions and type in Tailwind, and it should be the first one, TailwindCSS IntelliSense. If you install it, it's really helpful. I mentioned this earlier. What's really helpful about it is that you can now hover over. You might need to reload your code editor, but when you hover over a class, you can see exactly what CSS it applies. So this is really helpful for stuff like the values that we've been using before. You probably had no idea what height 64 was. Well, you now know what it's doing. It's setting the height to 16 rems or 256 pixels. So hopefully writing Tailwind CSS is going to make a lot more sense to you now that you actually understand what CSS is being applied without having to go to TailwindCSS.com and look at the documentation. Before we continue, one thing I wanted to add is just a little rating component. That is, if in the future you want to add ratings to your products, this is a really easy way to do so. With the help of our hero icons package, we can just create a separate component in our components folder called rating.js. So we'll make that rating component, and we want to return first a div with the classes flex, item center, and negative margin left 1. Within this div, we're going to have two different types of icons. We're going to have a filled icon, and then we're going to have an outlined icon. So the filled ones are for, if we have 4 stars out of 5, you see that we have 4 filled ones. And because we have 1 less than 5, we have an empty star to signify it didn't get 5 out of 5. Obviously, if it was 5 out of 5, it would be 5 solid stars. If it was 2 out of 5, it would be 2 solid stars and 3 outline stars, etc. So we can programmatically set how many filled stars and how many empty stars by using array.from. And this is a method that allows us to pass in an object where we can set the length of the array that we're creating. So we can kind of create an empty array, and then we can map over it. It has its own built-in map function, but we can also use on the created array the map function like this. And we need specifically, we don't need the value, but we need the index when we're mapping over this empty array. So we just provide an underscore and then grab the index and return a star icon from hero icons. We can import that. It should be solid, where since we're iterating over it, we want to set the index as the key, and we want to set the classes width 6, height 6, flex shrink 0, and text yellow 600. And you can see this is really helpful to have this IntelliSense, because now you see all of the available options when we start writing a given class name. So it's super, super helpful to have this. So again, this would be something that you would pass down to the rating component as a prop. For example, you would have maybe stars, and that's what you would set the length to. But we're just going to have this be a hard-coded value since this isn't an actual number. So if we save that, and if we go back to our product card, we want to provide this underneath our product name. So we want to import rating and put it right here. And if we save that, we can see we have 4 stars here. Oh, that looks a little bit too dark. Let's change it to text yellow 400, and that looks a lot better. We just need to add the empty star now at the end. So let's copy this, copy everything in the curly braces, and here we want to set the length of our created array to 1. And instead of star icon, we want to import star icon from hero icons react 24/outline, and we want to alias this to a new name such as empty star icon, or maybe outline star icon. So I'll call mine empty star icon, and I'll make it slightly smaller. We'll give it a width of 5, height 5, and we'll still give it the text yellow 400. And now when we save this, we have our one empty star here. I actually like it better at the width 6, height 6. So that looks good to me. Feel free to customize your rating component exactly how you like. And next we'll move on to setting up our shopping cart as well as formatting our prices here. Before we move on to working with our shopping cart, you might have noticed that if you make your screen a little bit smaller, you'll see that each of our images gets stretched out a bit. We don't want this to happen because, as you can see, it distorts how our product looks. The way to fix this using CSS, if we go into our individual product card component, is by adding a style prop and adding a property called object fit to contain. So object fit takes a bunch of different values, but what we want is contain in order to make sure that our image doesn't get stretched out. So once that's applied, you'll see that even if our card is very large as compared to the image doesn't stretch along with it. And you can take a look at how these different values of object fit can modify our image by playing with contain, cover, fill, as well as some additional values. But contain is what we want specifically for our product card images. We've successfully styled each of our product cards, but we want them to be functional at this point. And the way that we're going to make it possible to add items to our cart, to add multiple products and manage our cart, and then ultimately take those items in our cart and have our customers purchase them using Stripe Checkout is with the help of a very special tool called Use Shopping Cart. It's specifically designed to work with Stripe Checkout, and it makes working with Stripe on the client a lot easier and gives us a lot of tools all bundled into one hook called the Use Shopping Cart hook that makes it really effortless to do all the things that we'd want to do when it comes to building a shopping cart. So fortunately, we don't have to do this, create all of the logic, all the helper functions ourselves for adding things to the cart, removing items, clearing our cart, formatting currency, etc. And as you'll see, it also helps us out on the server side as well with some additional helper functions to make sure that what our customers check out with is actually a valid products in our inventory. So to get started, we need to install the Stripe/Stripe.js package and the Use Shopping Cart package. We're going to install two very specific versions. So we're going to run npm i stripe/stripe-js at 1.52.1, and we're going to install use shopping cart, use-shopping-cart at 3.1.6. The first step to using this hook, if we go to usage components cart provider, is to import the cart provider component from use shopping cart, that package, and to provide some essential props. Specifically, we want to set the cart mode, and we're going to be using the checkout session mode, meaning we're going to be using a server to check out, although there is a client-only option for those using Stripe Checkout. We're not going to be doing that. Checking out on the server is going to give us a lot greater control and give us a lot more configuration over Stripe Checkout. We need to provide a Stripe key, and this is the publishable key, the public key, and we also need to set a currency. What cart provider is going to do is it's going to inject or load the Stripe/Stripe.js library for us. Otherwise, we'd have to do that manually. And one thing to be aware of down the road is when we check out using a checkout session option for the cart mode prop, our products need to conform to this shape. But fortunately, we don't have to worry about this because our products are coming from Stripe. So they're already going to be in the valid format with all the information needed. We've already done the work on the home page, for example, to make sure our individual products conform to this shape. So the next step is going to be importing the cart provider, and we're going to, as I mentioned much earlier, do that within the app page. So go into pages_app, and surrounding the app layout, well, first above the app component, we want to import the cart provider and then use it around the app layout. Remember that we need to grab the publishable key. So as you can see here, there's this variable Stripe key, and it needs to be set to the next public Stripe publishable key environment variable. Cart provider takes a Stripe prop. That should be set to Stripe key. Cart mode should be set to checkout-session, and you can set the currency. Once again, I'm going to be using USD. So now that cart provider is set up, we can use the use shopping cart hook in any of our components. But before we do that, to close out this particular lesson, we're going to use a helper, a very convenient helper, that's going to allow us to format this price. So remember, this price is coming from Stripe, and it's expressed as a value in pennies, not in dollars. So to convert this, we can use a helper from the Use Shopping Cart package, a client-side helper called Format Currency String. So we can import it either from just Use Shopping Cart or Use Shopping Cart/core, and it accepts an object where we need to provide the value, which is just our product price, as well as the currency. And that would also come from the currency property for each of our products. So let's go into our product card, and we want to import format currency string from use shopping cart. We want to go down to where our product price is, and now we can just call that function and pass in an object where the currency is set to product.currency and the value is set to product.price. And with that, we can save, and if we head back, we now have a correctly formatted price here. Now that we've got our use shopping cart hook set up, we can make it possible to click this add to cart button for each of these individual products and have them added to the cart and display it in our header here. So how do we do that? Once again, this is going to involve our use shopping cart hook. And if we look at the different actions that it has, there's an add item action, which is just a function that takes a product. You can see all of the individual properties that it can accept, and we specifically want to use this in our product card component. So we want to use shopping cart. We can auto import it from use shopping cart here. We could also collapse our import from use shopping cart /core and just reference the format currency string here. We don't need to pass anything to the hook, and we get back an object, and that gives us the add item property, which is a function. And we specifically want to add this item when we click on the button. So we'll go down to the add to cart button and add an on click, and this will be connected to a new function which we'll call on add to cart. We'll make this function above our return. It doesn't need to be an async function. We can just add a normal function, and we can call add item and pass in our product. It's really as simple as that. Now we can save and attempt to add a product here. We'll click add to cart, and we're redirected to our individual product page, which doesn't exist yet. So we're attempting to click a button within a link, and to make that possible so that we don't redirect, because the button is a child element of our link, we just need to receive the event in our event handler function and call event.preventDefault. So if we try that again and hit add to cart, we see that we're not redirected, but it doesn't look like anything happened unless we inspect and go to application and go to local storage. If we go to this persist root key, you'll see that we have a bunch of information. Since our user is not being authenticated, we're not persisting it to a database, it's just being stored in local storage. And you can see all the information here, which is also accessible in our hook. We see the cart count, the number of items in our cart, the cart details, which is a structured object that includes all of our product data, our formatted total price, the price of everything in our cart, our total price that is not formatted, and then some internal data on this underscore persist property. So all of this is being managed internally. All of this state is being managed internally by the use shopping cart state. But we want to alert users that an item was added to the cart successfully. And for that, we're going to bring in a special library called React Hot Toast. And it gives us these nice toast messages that enable us to give our users some feedback. There's a bunch of different variants. We're just going to be using two in particular, and you can see them here when we click on the Make Me a Toast. We see a little loading spinner, so we'll have a loading toast and then we'll have a success toast. But to get started with React Hot Toast, we first need to install it. So in our terminal, we'll run npm i react-hot-toast, and we're going to be using the version 2.4.0. To get started with React Hot Toast, we need to add this special toaster component, and it needs to be added once again in our app page. So we want to add it underneath our component here. We'll make sure to import toaster from React Hot Toast. And once that's added, we can use the toast function wherever we like throughout our application to show our toast notification in a certain position. By default, it's going to be in the top center, which is fine. But if you wanted to change that, you could just set on the toaster component the position prop to any of these values that you see here. So within onAddToCart, we want to use that toast function to show our notification. So we can import toast from React Hot Toast, and we can say toast.loading. This is a function which accepts a couple of arguments, but we just need to provide one, and that is the message. We can say adding one item, and we'll get back an ID. The ID is helpful because it allows us to update a given toast later on. So instead of it being in the loading state, we can have it be a success toast. So after add item, we can say toast.success and then include some text and say in a template string product.name added. And then as the second argument, we can pass an object where we specify the ID referencing this toast that we created. So this allows us to update it with the specific text and a check mark later on. So let's save product card and see our toast message in action. And if we click on the mini sketchbook set, we click add to cart, we see mini sketchbook set added. We're now able to add items to our cart, but we want to see those state updates reflected in our header here. So how are we going to do that? Well, once again, we're going to use the use shopping cart hook. And if we take a look at the docs, we can see that it gives us some properties, some helpful properties, such as the formatted total price, the cart count, and the cart details to get all of the information about the added products. We just need to go into our header component. Remember that we have some hard-coded values here. We'll bring in use shopping cart, and for the price, we'll grab formatted total price, and we'll insert that here, and we'll also grab cart count, and we'll insert that in between the parentheses. And it's really that simple. We can save, and whenever we make changes to our cart, you can see that we currently have 5 items. Whenever we add a new item, we'll see that price, the formatted price, is updated immediately, as well as the cart count. Now let's move on to creating individual product pages. And from these pages, we should be able to not only add items to the cart, but increment the quantity, increment and decrement the quantity, so we can add multiple items to our cart at the same time if we like. When we go to an individual product page, you can see that the path begins with /products, and then at the end is a dynamic value of the ID of the product, and this is coming from Stripe. To make this possible, we need to generate these pages. It doesn't make much sense to have to fetch the pages every single time, meaning fetch the data for each one of these pages. What we can do is we can create paths for these pages at build time when our project is built, and then we can revalidate them on a recurring basis. So, for example, we currently have 8 products here, which means that we have 8 different pages. We can use Next.js to fetch all of the different product pages so that we can generate paths for them. For example, this is a path. This is a path. We're going to have 8 of them currently. And then for each of those paths, we can use the ID to get the individual product data. And if we were to update our product data or add new products, we can have Next.js attempt to regenerate the page at some specified frequency, such as once every hour, for example. So let's see how to do that. We can take a look at the Next.js documentation for generating the paths that we need using a function called getStaticPaths. And we use this in combination with getStaticProps. So first, we're going to need to fetch all of the products from Stripe to get our individual paths, and we'll create an array of objects like we see here with this params property where the ID is going to be set to the Stripe ID for that product, and then using that ID within getStaticProps, we're going to return the product data for our component. So let's first of all create an individual product page. We're going to create within pages a folder called products. So to create an individual route, as you've seen, we can create either a folder to contain multiple routes or just an individual page to create one route. We're going to create a dynamic route within products by creating a file where in brackets we're going to include the parameter ID and make sure that it's a JavaScript file. We're going to begin by again creating a component which we'll call product page. Right now we're just going to return a div with the text product and make sure that we can go to that page and see the text product. What we want to do right now is just take care of fetching the appropriate data and creating all of the necessary paths. So we just want to create one path for each product. So to begin, we'll use the getStaticPaths function. And once again, it's going to be very much like getStaticProps. We're going to use both of them in the same page. We're going to export an async function, getStaticPaths. And once again, to fetch all the product data, we can await stripe. So we'll import that from the utils folder, stripe.products.list. And we're going to get our inventory. And using that, we're going to map over inventory.data, but we don't need all of the fields from our product. We just need to return an object that has, once again, a params property on it, where we set the ID, the name of our parameter, to product.id. And we're going to put the resulting array in a variable called paths. And we want to return an object where we have a property paths and another property called fallback set to blocking. And the reason for this is we're going to be using a feature called incremental static regeneration. And this allows us to create or update static pages after we've built our site. So when our project is built, we'll have our first 8 products as individual paths according to their ID. But if we were to change this data, this function can be run again, and we'll have a new page. The benefit of this is that we do not need to rebuild the entire site. We don't need to redeploy it. But to get this working, we need to add a couple of properties. One is a fallback property. We can set that to blocking, and then within getStaticProps, we need to set a revalidate time. And as you can see here, when we set that, for example, to 10 seconds, Next is going to attempt to regenerate the page if there's new data at most once every 10 seconds. So right now we have getStaticPaths, and we need to add getStaticProps. So we want to export async function getStaticProps. And this is where we're actually going to get the product data. So we can go to our index page and grab all of the code that we had to get our individual products. We don't need to set a limit here. But one additional bit of code that we need to add is a way to find an individual product based off of its ID. Within getStaticProps, we're going to get params. So for each of these paths, we're going to receive on this params object the ID of the path that we're on. And this enables us within getStaticProps to find a given product according to its ID by using the find array method products.find. You can find the product where its ID is equal to params.id. We can put the product that we find in a product variable, and then we can return, as we had in our index page, a props object. But this time, instead of returning products, we just want to return product singular. And once you've added all of that, we can save and add and destructure the product prop from product page. We'll just console log that to make sure that it works, and we will refresh and open our console and inspect. And we see that we have an object, and it looks like the ID matches here. We have all of its data. If we go to a different product, we take a look at its ID, we can see that we're fetching all the appropriate product data that can now be displayed in its own page. And before we forget, let's make sure to add the revalidate property to get static props. It should be underneath the props object. And remember that if we were to set 10, that would be 10 seconds. Next.js will attempt to fetch new data every 10 seconds at the most. And that's only per request. So it's not going to attempt to revalidate our data unless someone accesses this page. So if nobody visits it, the data won't be updated until a user does so, until a user visits the product page. So instead of 10 seconds, we could set this to, for example, an hour. And to calculate that, we could just say 60 seconds times 60 minutes. So now we're revalidating this data if anything changes or if a new product is added every 60 minutes every hour. Now that we know that we're fetching the correct data for each individual product page, let's use that data to display a good-looking product page. So remember that we have our image here on the left. We have the name of the product. We show that it's in stock, the price. We have a couple of buttons to change its quantity, and we have an add to cart button. So let's create all of that here. We're going to jump back into the product page. We can remove the console log, and we'll start with a div. We'll give it the classes container on a large breakpoint, max width screen large. We'll center it with MX auto, set padding on the y-axis to 12, px 6, and within it we'll have a div with the classes flex, flex column. On a medium breakpoint, that'll be flex row, and justify between items center space y8. On a medium breakpoint, space y0, and also on a medium breakpoint, space x12. We're going to begin with the product's image. So we'll have one more div with the classes relative. The width will be 72, height 72, and on a small breakpoint, width will be larger at 98, and on a small breakpoint, the height will be 98. We'll bring in next image once again with all of the same values as before for our product card, where product image is set to source, alt is set to the product name. We'll use the fill prop. We'll use our object fit trick set to contain. The sizes will again be 100%, and because this is the only image, we're going to set it at priority to load it immediately. Then after this image div, we're going to have the product's details. So we'll have a div with the classes width full, flex 1, max width medium to give it a maximum width. You can see that that is 448 pixels. We'll give it a border with the border class, and we'll set its opacity to 50 with border opacity 50. We'll round it a little bit with rounded MD, give it a box shadow with shadow large, set its padding to P6, and background will be white. We'll display the name of the product with an H2, and we'll set the classes to text 3XL and font semi-bold. And the product, once again, will come from product. The product's name will come from product.name. Then after our H2, if we take a look at the final product, we'll have a check icon, a check hero icon, and then the text in stock on the right. So after the H2, we'll put both of these in a paragraph element with the classes pt2 to separate it from the name. We'll again use flexbox, items center, and space x2 to separate the two items on the x-axis. We'll bring in the check icon, and this will be specifically from 24/solid, and we'll give our check icon the classes text lime 500, and that will change the color to a lime, nice green, nice lime green color. And we'll set its width to 5 and height to 5. After that, we'll have a span as a sibling, and this will be a span with the text, with the class rather, font semi-bold and the text in stock. Now, outside of this paragraph element, we're going to have our price. And this is going to consist of a div with the classes margin top 4, border just on the top, so we can say border T, and we'll add some padding top set to 4. So now that this section's separated from the name and in stock text, we'll add a paragraph element within that div with the class text gray 500 and the text price, and underneath that paragraph will be another one with the classes text XL and font semi-bold. And this is where our price is going to be output. So once again, we will use the format currency string function, and we'll pass in the value from product.price and the currency from product.currency. So now we have our price being displayed. And then after this div here, we're going to have another one with the same classes, so we can just copy that. And this is where our quantity is going to be output, those two buttons that determine how many items should be added to the cart at a time. So we'll start with a paragraph element, again with the class text gray 500, and the text itself will be quantity. After this will be a div with the classes margin top 1, flex, items center, space x3. And this will consist of a button. This will be the minus button or the subtract button. So we want to style this by saying P1 rounded MD, and the hover state will be BG rows 100, and we'll add another hover pseudo class where we'll set the text to rows 500. And within this button, we'll have a minus small icon. These will be outline icons that we'll use, and we'll have the classes width 6, height 6, and flex shrink 0. So let's take a look at that. Okay, it looks good so far. When we hover over it, it's got this red color to it, like we have in our final version. After the button, after the minus button at least, we'll have another paragraph element with the classes font semi-bold and text XL. This is where we will insert the current count. We don't have that yet. This is something that we're going to need to store in state, so we're just going to use a 0 as a dummy value for now. We can go ahead and copy our button and change its values to be green for the colors, for the background and text colors. We also want to change the minus small icon to a plus small icon. Again, this should be an outline, and it's going to have the same classes as well. So clicking on these buttons is going to do nothing currently. And finally, underneath this div, we're going to add our add to cart button. So we'll create a button element with the text add to cart, where we'll set the classes on it width full, MT4, border, border lime 500, PY2, PX6, BG lime 500 for the background. When we hover over it, it should have a background of BG lime 600. When we hover over it, the border should also be border lime 600. We can add a focus ring around it by using the focus pseudo class and setting focus to ring-4. We'll set the ring opacity, again with focus ring opacity to 50. We'll set the color, the ring color to ring lime 500. The text of the button will always be white, so we'll set text white. And then finally, if the button's disabled, we can use the disabled pseudo class. We can use disabled to set the opacity of the button to 50 and use the cursor not allowed when it is disabled. So if we were to disable the button by using the disabled attribute, you can see the opacity is 50 and we get that not allowed cursor. If we remove it, it's back to normal. And I made a typo here. It should be ring lime 500, and we also want to add rounded MD as well to the button. So we now have our focus ring when we click on it, and we're now ready to make this add to cart button functional and see how to change the quantity to add multiple amounts of a given product to our cart. The final step within our individual product page is to make this quantity work, meaning to change the quantity using the plus and minus buttons. To do that, we need to create some local state. So make sure that we're on our product page, and we'll use state with the use state hook. And by default, this will be 1. It'll be the default value of our count. You can think of count as being the same as quantity. And the setter will be set count. So when we click on the button that has the minus icon, we can write an on click and call set count to take the current count and just subtract that value by 1, and for the plus button to add 1 to the count. Now we want to disable the minus button if we go less than 1. So if count is less than or equal to 1, we want it to be disabled. We don't want to make it possible to set the count to 0, for example. And then finally, we want to change our hard-coded value of 0 to what's actually in the count variable. So once we save that, we see that the quantity is 1 by default. We can increment it, and we can go back down to 1. But beyond that, we can't go further and subtract its value below that. So how do we actually change the quantity of what we're adding to the cart? Because right now this add to cart button isn't functional, but we saw back on the home page that we could only add 1 item to the cart. Well, we're going to grab the same functionality from the home page, specifically within the product card component. We can copy that function, that on add to cart function. We're going to head back to the product page. We can paste that above the return. Just make sure to import React Hot Toast, or the toast function from React Hot Toast rather. And we also want to bring in the use shopping cart hook, because we're going to need the add item function from that. We're still getting access to the product, but what's going to be different here is that if we look at the documentation for add item in actions, you'll see that it includes not only the product as the first argument, but we can pass an object where we can set the count, the number of that particular product to be added to our cart. So here we just need to add an object as a second argument and pass in count as the key and value, which we can just collapse to count. Now it makes sense to update our toast notification because it's not just going to be 1 item, it's going to be based off of the count value. So let's use a template string here for the loading method and instead say adding count items, and then using another interpolated value, compare count to 1. If count's greater than 1, then we want to make it plural. We're adding so many items, otherwise just leave that as an empty string. So we're either adding 1 item or multiple items. And then in the success, we can say count name added. So 3 of a given item added. And the very last step is to connect on add to cart to our add to cart button. So we can add an on click and just pass on add to cart as a reference. So if we save that and go back to our product page, click a certain quantity, increment the quantity to say 3, click add to cart, we see 3 billfold wallet added, and we see our cart count up here incremented by 3 as well. So that's working properly. And now after we can change the cart item quantity when we're adding a given product to our cart, we've completed our individual product page and we can move on to our cart page and displaying all of the items that we've added to our cart and the cart total in the next section. The next stage of our app is building out the cart page, where we'll display all of the individual items that we've added to our cart, the total, and make it possible to change the quantity of each of the items as well as remove them entirely from our cart You can see that all of this is possible in our deployed app, where we can change the quantity here, we can remove an item, and we see that the total updates accordingly. The first thing that we'll begin with is the title area here. Now, if we have some items added to our cart, we're going to see the text, your shopping cart, see how many items that we have. Again, that's the same cart count value that we're displaying up in our header. We also have the option to clear our entire cart by just clicking on this button. If we don't have any items, we just see the fallback text, your shopping cart's empty, check out our awesome products here, and that takes us to the home page. That's what we're going to create right now. We'll begin by creating an individual cart page. So in the pages directory, we'll make cart.js, and we'll export default a function cart page. And we want to begin by returning a div, a container div with the classes container, XL, max width screen, XL, MX auto, PY12, and PX6, like we have in other pages. And here we want to write a ternary where if the cart count is greater than 0, then we want to display the text that I mentioned, your shopping cart, a count of the items, and a button to clear all the items in our cart. But before we can write that, we need to bring in use shopping cart and get the cart count number. So if this is a positive number, we want to return that JSX. Otherwise, the fallback of your shopping cart is empty. Let's start with that. We're going to start with a couple of fragments because we're just going to have here an H2 element, and this autocomplete isn't working very well without adding something here in the true case. So let me just do that. I'm going to add an H2 in the else case with the text set to text 4XL, and we're going to make the font semi-bold. The text in the H2 is going to be your shopping cart is empty, and below that we're going to have a paragraph with the classes MT1 and text XL. So our text here in this paragraph is going to be check out our awesome products, and once again we'll add a little space because then we're going to add a link component that's going to link users to our home page to prompt them to actually add some products to the cart. And we're going to include a class of text red 500 and underline to this link, and this link is going to have the text here. So if we reverse this condition, because we currently have items in our cart, we can see it. If we first import, made a mistake, if we import next link, we can now see that. But of course, if the conditional is correct, because we do have items in our cart, we just see a div. Let's replace that with another fragment where once again we're going to have an H2. So we can copy the H2 that we just wrote. It's just going to have some different text of your shopping cart, and then another paragraph element with the same classes. And here is where we want to insert the cart count items. So in our case, that would be 9 items. And we'll add a space at the end. And as a sibling element, we'll add a button to clear all items in the cart. And this button is going to have the classes opacity 50. If we hover over it, it should have opacity of 100. We'll set text to base. So this sets the size, and we want to capitalize the text. So if we save that, we see our button here, and this button needs to be inside the paragraph. That was my mistake. And re-add our space. So if we click on this button, nothing happens. How do we get it to clear our cart? Well, there's another action for that. There is the clear cart action, which totally empties out the shopping cart. And we don't need to pass anything to it. It just dumps everything that we have stored in state and in local storage. This comes again from use shopping cart. So we'll grab clear cart and we'll add an on click. And we want to write an inline function and then call in the return of that function clear cart. So at this point, if we attempt to clear our cart, we click clear all of the items in our cart were removed, so the price goes back to 0, the cart count is 0, and we see the fallback text in our cart page. The next addition that we'll make to our cart page is the total that we see at the bottom, including this Go to Checkout button. This total displays the formatted total that we have in our cart, and it updates immediately. And the Go to Checkout button is what's going to be responsible for taking our users to Stripe checkout to finish their purchase. So let's finish that part. And all of this can be added. We can collapse the conditional, the ternary that we have here. We can add it underneath. And here we can say if cart count is greater than 0, we only want to display the total. If that is the case, then we'll return a div with the class names, with the classes mt12 and space y4. And within this div, we'll have another div element with the classes flex, flex column, items end, to place it at the very end, the most right-hand side of the page here. We'll have border T for border top. We'll set py to 4 and margin top to 8. And within this div, we'll have a paragraph element with the text total, and we'll include once again a little space. And this paragraph is going to have the class text XL, and within this paragraph element, we'll write a span with the class font semi-bold, and this is where we want to place our formatted total price. This is going to come once again from use shopping cart. We'll grab formatted total price and insert it here. And if we save that, we can preview how that looks if we have something in our cart. So let's go ahead and add something. We see our total here. You might need to re-add that space. Sometimes if you're using a tool like Prettier, it gets rid of it. And then underneath the paragraph element is where we're going to put our checkout button. So this is going to be a button with the text Go to Checkout, and it's going to have a lot of classes. It's going to have the class border, rounded, py2, px6. The background is going to be BG yellow 500. If you hover over it, we'll make it a little bit darker. So we'll say hover BG yellow 600. We'll set the border to yellow 500 as well and change it on hover to border yellow 600. We'll set the focus ring to 4 in width. We'll set the focus ring opacity to 50, and we'll set its color with ring yellow 500. We'll make the button text white. We want to transition the colors. So this class gives us a nice little set of styles that helps us transition the colors, and we're going to be doing that whenever we disable the button. So if the button's disabled, we want to set opacity to 50. Once again, the disabled cursor will be not allowed. And if it's disabled on hover, the background will be yellow 500. And then finally, we want to set the margin top to 4 and the max width to max, which just means max width is max content. So let's save that and see how it looks. And right now, of course, it's not functional, but ultimately this button is going to be used to take all of the products that the users added to the cart and enable the user to check out with them. The last major component that we need to add to our cart page is a preview of our product. And this is going to summarize all of the important information: the image of the product, its name, the quantity that we have for it in our cart, as well as how much each individual product costs. And we have this X button, this delete button, where if we click it, we'll be able to remove that item entirely from our cart. To display all of the items in our cart, we'll use a property that we haven't used before, but it lists all of the information that we've added to our cart whenever we use the add item action, and that is the cart details property. So heading back to our cart page, we can grab from the use shopping cart hook cart details, and we can log that to the console just to see what's in it. When we open up our console, we see we have an object where the key is the product ID, and it's set to an object with all of the data that you see here. you can see that it includes some additional values that we didn't directly set on it. So in order to display all of our different products from this object, we're going to use a special function, object.entries. And we can demo it here by copying this object. We can store it as a global variable. And if we pass this object to object.entries, we see that we get an array of arrays. And this gives us the key separate from the object, its value. So this is going to allow us to easily iterate over each product in our cart details object. We do that by turning that object into an array, in this case an array of arrays. We're going to display all of our individual cart products within the div, within the area that we just created for our cart total. And this is the div with the class margin top 12 and space y4. Within that div, we're going to say object.entries, and we'll pass in the cart details and use the map function. And instead of just getting what we would call the product, we can, within the parameters, destructure, using array destructuring, destructure the key and the corresponding product. And we want to add an extra set of parentheses around this to be able to do that. And then, again, since we're using the map function, in the return of the callback to map, this is where we can iterate over the component that we haven't created called cart product, where the key is going to be set to the key. And remember, it's this value. It's really the ID. It's the product ID here. Feel free to call it that. And we'll pass down all of the product data, this object here, on a prop of the same name. So we need to go ahead and create this cart product component. We'll do it once again in the components folder. Name it cart product. Export default a component cart product, and first we'll destructure our product prop from the props object. We'll go back to the cart page and make sure to import it and save. And now we can focus on building the structure of our cart product component with everything that you see here. So we want to display the image, the name, once again, our quantity buttons, a total, the price of each product at the very end, and our delete button. We'll begin within cart product by returning a div with the classes flex, justify between, space x4, hover. When we hover over it, we'll set the box shadow to large. We'll also set the border opacity to 50. We'll add a border class, border opacity 0 by default, rounded MD, padding 4, BG white. Within this div, we'll include a link, so we'll import next link. And this is going to take our users to that product. If they click on the link, it'll take them back to that product page. So we'll set the href using a template string to /product/product.id with the classes flex, item center, space x4, and group. Within the div, within the link, we'll add a div with the classes relative, width 20, height 20, group, hover, scale 110. So this is going to mean that when we hover over this, our image will become a little bit larger because this is going to wrap our product image. And we'll set transition to transform, so we have a smooth transition in size. We'll use the image component from next image, where, as we've done multiple times now, we'll set source to product.image, the alt text to product.name, fill and style set to object fit contain. If we take a look at the result, we have our image here. It increases in size when we hover over it, and because we're using that group class, we're also able to add a slightly larger box shadow to the entire component. Then outside of this div that we just created, but still within the link, we'll create a paragraph with the classes font, semi-bold, text XL, group, hover, underline, and in the paragraph we'll insert the product name. Now after the link, we'll create a div with the classes flex and items center. That will contain a div with the classes flex, items center, space x3, and this is where we'll include our buttons to change the quantity. We can go ahead and copy this from our individual product page. Everything within the div we can copy from the first button to the second button and paste it in here. We want to remove the on clicks for now, but we do want to disable the button according to the product quantity. So if we take a look in the console, we'll see that there's an associated quantity property for each of our products. So we can use that and say if the product quantity is less than or equal to 1, we want to disable it. And instead of count here, we'll display product.quantity. Now, the last thing that we need to do in this instance is to bring in the minus small icon, which is an outline component, and plus small icon. So make sure both of those are imported, and we can see what that looks like. We see that the buttons don't work, but we'll get to that in the future section. And then underneath this div, we want to display each product's individual price. So this value is not going to change. We'll display this within a paragraph element, and it'll have the classes font semi-bold, text XL, and margin left 16. We'll bring in the X mark icon component. This is again another outline icon from Hero Icons with the classes hidden, width 4, height 4, text gray 500, but it'll be visible on larger breakpoints. We'll set that with the class inline block, margin right 4 and margin bottom 1. And then after this icon, we don't need to use the format currency string helper. What we can do is use the formatted price or potentially formatted value properties that we have here from the product. So we can say product.formatted price. And if we save and take a look at that, we see that we have a correctly formatted price. And then finally, after this paragraph, we want to include our delete button. So we'll create a button element with the classes margin left 4. If we hover over it, we'll set text red 500. And this button is going to consist of a X circle icon component, which again is going to be an outline component with the classes width 6, height 6, flex shrink 0, opacity 50, hover opacity 100, and just to let you know, there's also a transition class for opacity if we want to more gradually, more subtly change the opacity whenever we hover over a given element. So now we can save cart product and we can see the final result here. And at this point, we're ready to make it possible to change the quantity of a given item in our cart as well as delete it entirely. Now that we have a product added to the cart, we want to be able to change its quantity once it's in the cart. And for that, we can use another action, which is set item quantity. For this action, again from the use shopping cart hook, we need to pass the ID of the product that we're updating and pass in whatever the quantity, the new quantity we want to be in state as the second. For our buttons here, we would have the minus button decrement it, the quantity value by 1, and the plus button to increment it. This is once again in our cart product component. So we'll bring in use shopping cart, and this is the set item quantity function. We want to add an on click to the minus button and pass in product.id as the first argument, and as the second again, we just want to decrease its value by 1, so we can just say product.quantity minus 1. We can copy this and provide the same on-click to our plus button, but just change the minus to plus in the second argument. So now let's save cart product and see the result. If we attempt to increase the value, it increases our total, and we see that it's updated everywhere in the cart count, as well as our value here being incremented properly for our individual product quantity. We can decrement it down to 1, and we can increase it as much as we like. Before we move on to making it possible to check out our cart, let's add the ability to remove individual items in our cart. So if we were to click on this delete button, we would remove all 6 of this organize set product that we have here. Once again, we can take a look at the documentation to find an action that we need, and this is the remove item, which is the opposite of the add item action. To remove an item, we just need to pass in the product ID of the particular product that we'd like to remove. This is again going to be added in our cart product component, and if we find the very last button that we added with the X circle icon inside it, here we can add an on-click and write an inline arrow function where in the return we'll call remove item. We haven't brought that in from our hook, our use shopping cart hook, but we will in just a second. And we're going to pass it an argument of product ID. So we'll grab remove item, save, and if we have an item that we'd like to remove, let me add a few items here. I'll add this one and another. And so if we click on remove item, we see that the appropriate item was removed. And if we want to remove each item individually, we can go ahead and do that until we have no items in our cart. In this video, we're going to completely finish the checkout functionality for our cart. So all of the items that are in our cart, once we add them and our user goes to the cart page, they should be able to click on go to checkout and be taken to a custom created Stripe checkout page where they can provide all of their payment information so that we can process their payment and ultimately deliver their products. To make this possible, we're going to be using a feature of Next.js called Next.js API routes. This is the folder that we kept from the very beginning of the course where we had a dummy API route in the API folder. Now we are going to start creating a few, and these will be specifically created to handle a checkout session. Before we create our API routes, however, we're going to begin by making a request on the client when our user checks out. We're going to need to send data to our API route. And if we take a look at the Next.js docs, this is what our API route looks like. It's going to receive a request, and all the data that we need is going to be on this request object. You can see that it's just, you can think of it like a plain function that receives a request, and we're going to return a response, and it'll hopefully be a successful one. API routes are just API endpoints that we make requests to. So we're going to start in our cart page. We can remove the console log that we had here, and we're going to add a async function called onCheckout. We're going to call this function when we click on the go to checkout button. So we'll add an onClick and attach a reference to onCheckout there. And we only want to call this if cart count is greater than 0. We're also going to have some local state to determine when we are redirecting. So in the final app, when we check out, we'll see our buttons disabled and we see redirecting. That's because we're going to be taken to an external page for our user to check out, an external URL. So we'll create a piece of state that by default will be false, and it'll be called is redirecting, and the setter will be set redirecting. So if the cart count's greater than 0, we want to set up a try catch to handle any errors. And we want to say set redirecting true. And we want to make a request to our endpoint with all of our cart details, with everything in our cart. So we're going to need to install a library. It's not required, but I personally like using it. We're going to install a library to make that HTTP request, specifically a POST request, and this library is called Axios. So we can say npm i axios at, and we'll be using version 1.3.5. Now when that's installed, we can bring in Axios up at the top, and we want to await, because this is going to return a promise, await axios.post. We're going to make a request to /API/checkout-sessions. And we're going to provide all of our cart details as the second argument. And this is all of the data. And we want to get back specifically an ID. So we'll get back an object, and on it's going to be an ID. But to get that ID, we are going to need to grab, using a then callback, the data property. So we want to be given what's called a session ID from this endpoint. That's all we're doing here. We're just making a POST request with our cart details, and we're ultimately going to get back an ID, which we can use to go to the checkout. And use shopping cart has a helpful function, redirect to checkout. So we can grab that from use shopping cart, and we're going to need to await redirect to checkout, and then pass in our session ID here. We're going to put the returned value in this variable called result, and if result has an error property, we just want to console log the result. Additionally, we want to use the catch block to catch any errors, and here we can say console.log, and in both cases we could just say error and pass through the error message. So here too we could say error in result. And then finally, we can set redirecting to false. The finally block is just going to make sure that redirecting is set to false, whether it resolves successfully in the try part or in the catch part. And one more thing that we can do before we move on to our API route is we can add the disabled property to our button, and we want to set that to true when is redirecting is true. Plus, in the button text, we could also say if we're redirecting, we display the text redirecting. We tell the user what's happening. And if we're not, we just say our default text of go to checkout. So now we're making a request to this endpoint that we haven't created yet. So within our pages folder in API, we need to create a subfolder called checkout-sessions. We're going to have a couple of API routes here. The first one that we want to add is just going to be index.js. So make sure that it's within checkout sessions, not within the main API folder. We're going to begin by creating a basic handler function, just like the one that we see here. We're going to export default a function called handler, which has a request and a response. And this is going to be an async function, because we're going to be doing some async operations here. And what's important is that this API route can receive any type of request. So we want to make sure that we're only receiving a POST request by adding a conditional and saying if request.method is equal to the string POST in all caps, only then are we going to process the checkout session. Otherwise, else, we want to respond by setting the allow header to post to say we only allow a POST request here, and also respond with a status of 405, which just means unaccepted method, and we can end with the text method not allowed. This is just standard boilerplate for writing these type of API routes if you only want to handle one type of request. Now we're going to write the business logic in order to actually allow our user to check out. The first thing that we need to do is validate that the data being sent here includes the right price. We don't want anyone to be able to tamper with the price, for example, and set it to $0 or something. So we're going to begin by, within a try catch, we're going to get the data from the request body. That's what it's going to be on, that cart details data. So we're going to put this in a variable called cart details. That is the entire request body. And once again, we want to bring in Stripe from our utils folder. So we'll await stripe.products.list. And we want to use a special helper from use shopping cart on the server to make sure that we have valid data. And this is a server-side helper called validate cart items. And the reason that we're bringing in Stripe to list all of our products is to make sure that the cart items that we're receiving on the request actually matches our inventory. So first we need to pass in our inventory and then pass in the cart items, the cart details, as the second argument. So let's get all of our products, again using the list method. We'll get our inventory, and once again we want to expand data.defaultPrice, and we will perform the same operation where we mapped over inventory.data, where for each product we're getting the price from product.defaultPrice, and we're returning the currency from price.currency, the ID from product.id, the name from product.name, the price from price.unit underscore amount, and the image from product.images, and the 0th element. So we're getting all the products in our inventory, and now we can bring in the validate cart items helper. So we want to import validate cart items from use shopping cart / utilities and make sure that's imported correctly as validate cart items. Again, we'll pass in our products, which is our inventory, and our cart details that we're receiving from the client. And this is going to make sure that they're valid and give us back line items that we can use with Stripe checkout. So now, one bit of the Stripe documentation that we haven't covered is the checkout documentation, and specifically checkout sessions. So we want to create a checkout session, and we're going to be setting a number of different properties. The first thing that we need to provide is a mode, and there's a few options here. We want to just have it be a one-time payment, so we're going to be choosing the payment option. We can also set, if we scroll down, the payment method types, and you can see all of the different values that we have here. We're just going to keep it simple and select card, although there's a bunch of different values, a bunch of different ways to accept payment that might be useful in your country. I'm just going to stick to card, to credit card. We want to then include the line items that we're getting. So this is the first required parameter. This is all of the data that we're getting back from the validate cart items. And then finally, we're going to include a success URL where the user is going to be taken after they've purchased successfully, and an optional cancel URL. Where are they going to go if they cancel the purchase? So let's provide all of those by awaiting stripe.checkout.sessions.create. We'll set modes to payment, payment method types to an array, include all of the different payment method types you'd like to include for your users, for your customers. We'll set line items to line items here. We'll set the success URL to be based off of the origin that we're getting from the request. So the request object gives us a headers property that includes the origin of our request. And we want to be that URL, that hostname / success, and then we want to add a query param of session underscore ID. And if we set it to session underscore ID and set it equal to a set of curly braces and include the special variable in all caps of checkout session ID, we're going to get the created session ID returned for us in the URL, and we'll see this is going to be very useful for fetching all of our customers' data, such as where an invoice email was sent to, all of their relevant information that was included in checkout. And then finally, we're going to have a cancel URL where we can again use request headers origin, and we're just going to take them to the cart page if they cancel it. So we're going to get back a session, and we can ultimately return this to the client by saying res.status200, meaning that this was a successful request, and we want to send back as JSON the session data. And finally, we'll make sure that we're catching any errors. We'll log them to the console, and in that case, we want to return res status 500 with a JSON object where we include the status code of 500 and the message property from error.message. So with all that, we can save, make sure we don't get any errors. We can save everything, and we can head back to our cart page, and we can test that our checkout works as planned. Make sure that we have items in our cart, and then we'll select go to checkout. We're going to be redirected, hopefully, to a checkout page at checkout.stripe.com. We can see our total. We see that we're going to be paying Epic Store, and this is in test mode. Again, we're not going to be using a real credit card. We can see the itemized products here. We see a mini sketchbook set with its image and price, as well as a billfold wallet. And now we just need to provide our personal information in order to pay. And we can provide our email, and after that, we can add some dummy card information by including 42 repeating. Just say 4242, provide our name on the card, do the same for our zip code, and hit pay. And if our purchase was successful, we should be taken to the success page. We see a session ID here with the created session added at the end of our URL. And if we head to our Stripe dashboard, we should be able to see a new customer here, their name, email, payment method. And if we click on them individually, we'll be able to see more information, such as their individual purchases, and be able to make changes to their customer data if necessary. To close out this section, before we move on to the success page, let's talk about the appearance of our individual checkout page. So when we go to checkout, by default, you'll see something that looks like this, or maybe something even more plain with a white background. We can change the branding of our checkout page by going to the Stripe dashboard and searching for branding. So we'll go to Settings, Branding, and we just want to customize the appearance of our checkout. Fortunately, it's got all the elements that we need for our users to check out easily and validate all of their input, but we want to align it with the appearance of our actual store. So if you're going off of the design here and our logo and everything, as well as the colors, in branding, we can set the icon or the logo. And if we click on the input, we can choose a file. And in our case, we want to choose one in our public folder, and that is the logo.png file. So we have a PNG of our app logo, the logo and the text. We can open that, and this is what's now going to be displayed prominently at the top of our checkout page on the left-hand side, or if we're on mobile, at the top next to the back button. And we can also set the brand colors. So the colors for this are pretty plain. It's just gray and black. So the primary brand color would be F7, F7, F7. So this very light gray that we have as the background. And the accent color is black, so we can just do 0, 0, 0 for that. Feel free to customize it exactly the way that you want. The really neat thing about branding is that it's quite easy to customize not only the checkout and payment links, but also the appearance of the customer portal. If you want to create a custom portal for users to update their plans, this is useful if your users have a subscription or something like that, as well as some other pages that are relevant. It helps us also update the invoices that are sent to our customers' email. By default, they're sent automatically whenever a user checks out. So make sure you configure that to your liking, and when we go back and attempt to check out, if we've saved those changes, and I currently have not, if we save the changes in the top right-hand corner and attempt to go to the checkout page again, we see those changes are applied, and we have a unified experience where we have the trust of Stripe. So we're taken to a Stripe domain, and we see that this is powered by Stripe, but we have the branding and we have the uniqueness of our own product here, which is really nice. if our customer checked out successfully, they're taken to the success page. We don't have a page currently for that, so that's why we're seeing this 404. To fix that, we'll go into our pages directory and create a success.js file. We're going to export default if function success page. And on this success page, we're going to have a few different states. And this is going to be based off of the created session that we have. We're getting the session ID of that created session in our URL. And the different states are going to be based off of, first of all, if we have a successful order. So to confirm that the purchase was made successfully, we're going to use a new API endpoint to retrieve a session, a checkout session, based off of this ID. So we're going to be making a request to an endpoint that we'll create in just a bit, but we're going to have three different states: a success state, a loading state, and an error state. Right now we're just going to focus on creating the user interface and not making the request or the API endpoint. So we're just going to have some dummy variables. We're going to have one called data, and that's going to be set to false, and one called error set to false. So this is going to be our loading state. Now we're going to begin in creating our UI with the error state actually. So we'll set that to true, and we're going to begin with a div. It's going to look a lot like most of the container divs that we've created. It's going to have all of the same classes, so feel free to copy it from another page, such as the cart page. Here we're also going to set text to center, and we're going to include a ternary here, a couple of ternaries, where if we have an error, first of all, we're going to have one state, so we're just going to have a dummy div right now. Then we're going to check and see if we have no data, meaning a loading state. That's going to be a different UI. We're going to return some different JSX for that. And then finally, if we do have a successful order and we are able to retrieve that checkout session, that will be the final state. But first, if we have an error state, we're going to start with a div that has the classes p2, rounded MD, bg rows 100, text rows 500, max width medium, and mx auto. And here we're just going to display some text within a paragraph where the class is going to be text large, and we're going to say, sorry, something went wrong. So that's our error state. For the loading state, we're going to again have a div that will have very similar classes to our div above. The only differences are going to be, we're not going to have bg rows of 100 or text rows 500. It'll instead have text gray 500, and within a paragraph with the same class, text large, we're going to display the text loading. And then finally, if we have a successful purchase and are able to retrieve the checkout session based off of its ID, we're going to have a div with the classes py4, px8, space y4, rounded medium, max width large, and mx auto. We're going to have a big check mark up at the top, so we're going to bring in the check circle icon. This is going to be a solid icon. It'll have the classes width 24, height 24, mx auto, flex shrink 0, and text lime 600. So it's going to be a big green check mark, and underneath it will be an H2 with the classes text 4XL, font semi-bold, flex, flex column, items center, and space X1. Within this will be the text, thanks for your order. And after the H2, we'll have a paragraph, once again with the class text large, where we want to say check your email, and we're going to include their email from the checkout session for your invoice to tell them where to go next and what extra info to find about their purchase. So if we save this and take a look, we're going to see an error. This is our error state if error is set to true. If error and data are false, we're going to see our loading state. And then finally, if we do have data, we're going to see thanks for your order, check your email for your invoice. So next, we're going to see how to create the API route to retrieve our checkout session and how to display that here on the success page. To finish our success page, we need to retrieve a session within an API route. So we're going to go to the checkout API, see how to retrieve a checkout session from Stripe once again, and we're going to use stripe.checkout.sessions.retrieve. There's really nothing to this particular method. We just need to pass it the URL query param that includes the ID of the checkout session that we'd like to retrieve. We'll begin this time on the back end, and we're going to start in our API folder in checkout sessions, and we're going to create a dynamic route there as well. It'll be identical to the dynamic route that we created on the client. We're going to give it a name with brackets on either side. We're going to call the query parameter here ID. So that's what we're going to be receiving from the client when we make a request to our API route. We're once again going to export default an async function with the name handler, which has a request and a response. And we're going to get the ID, which is really the session ID, from request.query.id. We'll set up a try catch, and we're going to attempt to retrieve our session. But first, if we don't have an ID, a valid ID, and if we take a look at what it should look like, if it doesn't start with CS underscore, so if not ID.starts with, which is a string method, if it doesn't start with CS underscore, then we want to throw a new error with the message incorrect checkout session ID. And we'll catch that error in the catch block. We'll console log the error, and we want to return res status 500 again with a JSON object, which includes the status code 500 and the message from error.message. But if this doesn't throw an error, if we're actually passing a valid checkout session ID to our API route, we can await stripe.checkout.sessions.retrieve and pass in the ID as the one argument, and we should get back a checkout session, which we can then return to the client with res status 200 and pass back as JSON that checkout session object. So our API route's done. Once again, we can wrap it in a big if else. So we can say if, in this case, request method equals get, then we're going to perform all of this. Else, we can return a response where we set the allow header to get instead of post. We're only allowing a get request. And to make this request on our client, you might be inclined to reach for something like use effect, but a far better way to make a request, especially in a Next application, or it really could work for any React application, is a hook, a custom tool like SWR. SWR is made by the same people behind Next.js and Vercel. It's just a simple hook that we can call that makes it far better to fetch data and gives us a lot of related state that we need, and in particular tells us information such as when we have data, when we're loading, and when we have an error. So to use SWR, we can once again go to our terminal and say npm i SWR at 2.1.3. And if we take a look at some examples, there's really not a whole lot to learn about this use SWR hook, which allows us to perform a GET request very easily. It also integrates very well with Axios. We just need to provide it a key, which can double as our URL, and it's then passed to this function called a fetcher, which actually performs our HTTP request. So we want to perform this within our success page. We'll bring in use SWR, And we can do so manually by saying import use SWR from SWR. And here we need to give it a key, and this is the API endpoint. So we can write that as API, rather slash API slash checkout dash sessions slash the session ID. Now, where are we going to get this session ID? Remember, we're getting it from the URL, and we have this query parameter, session underscore ID. We can use the use router hook from Next in order to get the session ID and put it in a variable of the same name by saying router.query, my mistake, dot session underscore ID. And now we have a complete URL to make a request to. That URL is then provided as a parameter to a function, which is provided as the second argument. So we can just write an inline function where we can use Axios. We can say axios.get URL, and within a then callback, we get back the response, and we can return the data property from it. So before attempting to display anything in our UI, let's just see what use SWR returns. I'm just going to log all the stuff that it returns. And if we check out our console, we see that we get an object where at first we have is loading set to true, and then after a little while it's still true. So let's see what happens if we refresh the page. Well, we're getting a 500 error, so are we performing a bad request? Let's see. So we're making a request to slash API slash checkout slash session slash undefined. Let's see if we can get the session ID when we open the console. We are, but it takes a little bit of time for the router to get the session ID on the client. So to fix this, we can write this key value as an inline function, and in the return, we can say only if we have the session ID are we going to use this URL, otherwise null. And by providing null here, if session ID is a falsy value, then this request is not going to be made. So let's try this again and see what happens. Let's refresh. So if we check our network tab, it looks like the request URL actually has the session ID on it, and we get back a response with a bunch of data on it. And this is all the data that we included in at least one of the successful checkouts that we had. So it includes important stuff like the name, email, the amount, when it was created, etc. So what we need to do now is grab all of the relevant state that's being returned from the use SWR hook, and instead of stuff, we're going to use data and error. And let's try to log those two. We'll refresh, and great. After a second, and then the first second you saw that it was loading, well, we had that loading state, and then we get back all of the data and for error undefined. So now, making use of this data, and if we go into it, you can see all of the relevant customer details here. We can use that in order to display the email that the user should check. So we can create an email variable and get it from data if we have it. So we want to use the optional chaining operator to make sure that we don't get an error when attempting to get a property that might not exist. And then from customer details dot email, we can then insert that into our parentheses here, like this. So now we're displaying the email that the user needs to check, the one that they checked out with. And finally, the very last step is that we want to clear our cart when this is successful. And fortunately, as a third argument, we can provide within this object some callback functions. You can see a number of them here, and we're going to choose the onSuccess callback. So we can just write this as a method. So when this is successful, if we actually have a 200 response or we have data here, we want to clear the cart. And again, this is an action that comes from use shopping cart. From that object, we can grab clear cart. We just need to call this to remove everything. Obviously, after purchase, the user isn't going to want to purchase those items again. And immediately when we make those changes, we see our carts cleared after our request is made again. Now we're ready to push our e-commerce store to the web. For this step, you're going to need a GitHub repository, so make sure you have a GitHub account and you're signed in, and head to github.com/new and pick a repository name. I'm going to call mine Epic Store. I'm going to make mine private and create my repository. I'm going to grab the remote origin I'm given. So this step is going to assume you've already connected or figured out how to connect Git with GitHub. There are tons of guides on how to do this. If you just take a look on Google, it's very straightforward to do so. Right now, we're just going to need to add a remote origin. And so that's the way that we're going to connect all of the changes that we make with Vercel. So make sure that you have a Vercel account as well. We'll begin by, in our terminal, adding our remote. We'll add one last commit. We'll say store complete, and we can push those changes to our GitHub account, to our new repository by saying git push -u origin main. Once that's done, we can head to Vercel and add a new project. We'll import the Git repository we just created, and it should populate the correct framework preset of Next.js. We don't need to change any of the build and output settings. We just need to provide the environment variables. So we'll go to our env.local file. We'll copy everything and select the first input for our environment variables and paste those values in. You see that they're automatically copied, which is great. And then we can hit deploy. So after about a minute or so, we can see that our project was deployed successfully. And if we click on the image, we can see our store working in production. We're able to add items to the cart. Everything works perfectly. So thanks so much for taking this course. Congratulations for making it to the end. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did making it. You now have a really solid base for any e-commerce app, any type of e-commerce store or marketplace that you want to make. It's really easy now to convert all of the test products and test keys that we have to something that actual users, actual customers can purchase. Feel free to use this as the start of a new business, add it to your portfolio. Now that we've deployed it to the world, make sure to show off what you've made. Thanks again for watching and for all of your hard work, and I hope to see you in the next epic project.